Next up, we have a little change in our plan. Next up, we have Dr. Lindsay Galway from Lakehead University, and she'll be presenting on climate emotions in remote, rural, and small communities across Canada. Welcome, Lindsay. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. And my audio and screen are coming through okay, Ali?
Loud and clear.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, thank you for the invitation to share some of my work. Thank you all for being here today. And thank you very much to the organizers as well. So as Ali said, my name is Lindsay Galway. I am an associate professor at Lakehead University and very privileged in that I hold a Canada Research Chair position in social ecological health. And so I'm joining today from the traditional territory of Fort William First Nation, a nation I've had the great privilege of learning and working with over the last number of years, and also Robinson Superior Treaty Territory. So as Ali presented, the research that I'm presenting today is titled Climate Emotions in Rural, Remote, and Small Communities Across Canada. And it actually was just published. This paper that you can see on your screen there is available open access. It was published last month for any of you that really want to dig in and learn a little bit more than the presentation that I'm able to give today in a rather short time frame here. And so I also apologize my voice. I lost my voice earlier this week, so I might need to sip some tea along the way just to keep my voice alive for the next 15 minutes or so. Um, and so the purpose of this work really was to dig in deep and explore and provide in-depth and rich descriptions of lived experiences of climate emotions, specifically in this context of rural, remote, and small communities across what we presently call Canada. And so there's a number of reasons why I was interested in exploring this area in this particular context. This included, I have a broad interest in my research program generally around climate change and mental health, of advancing conceptual clarity. So many of us that work in this space, we hear all these terms and we know all these terms, but there really is in the research world, and this is relevant for the practice world, a lack of conceptual clarity. So I've increasingly used in my work, and I continue to increasingly use climate emotions as a concept. And so with this work, I also wanted to move forward on this notion of conceptual clarity in relation to climate emotions. So in my work, I'm defining and describing climate emotions as the feelings, emotions, and affects that are related to the climate crisis and also related to climate injustices. And I also was really keen in this study to address a whole range of gaps in our understanding around lived experiences of climate emotions in this context of rural, remote, and small communities. We know that there's tons of research gaps around climate change research broadly, lots of research gaps around climate and health and climate and mental health research in this context. So wanting to help move forward and address some of those gaps as well. And then another interest for this study, as you'll see when I move into the methods here in a moment, was exploring and considering the utility of letter writing as qualitative data. So I have a broad interest as well in my research program of, in some ways, moving beyond qualitative data in terms of interviews and focus groups. This is what we use often and generally rely on for qualitative data, but also wanting to use letters as a source of data. And then consider how that worked and some of the value of doing so. So moving on to brief summary or overview of the methods for this study. So I use semi-structured interviews. So the interviews were very conversational in nature and actually very rich, very in-depth, and very lengthy in most cases. And we also use this process, as I mentioned, of what we call asynchronous letter writing. So these data were collected throughout 2023. And those who participated in our study were 16 years of older, of course, living in rural, remote, small communities and towns, and also identified as experiencing emotional responses and or impacts related to climate change. And so you can see on table one here, this is a summary of some of the participant socio-demographic characteristics. So of course, wanting a range of representation across a number of important socio-demographic characteristics, including gender, age, race, socioeconomic status, and education. And one of the things I also did in this work that I'm doing in some of my other work as well around climate emotions is thinking about this in the context of biomes. So we wanted also representation of experiences across the five major biomes of Canada, and aiming to, in that way, capture diversity in terms of climate hazards, climate impacts, and climate vulnerability. So now I want to dig into a little bit this context or this notion, remote, rural, and small communities. So for those of you who work in this context will know well that there is no agreed upon or consistent way of defining, describing, characterizing this context or these communities. And so in this context, so for this work, I actually think it's helpful to think of rural, remote, and small communities in this context broadly as beyond the metropolis. And of course, the metropolis, this is inspired by some of the work of Bell and Jane. The metropolis are those centers that hold power, that decision-making power, where much of the impacts or the relationship to climate impacts are held and decisions around climate impacts are taken. And so beyond the metropolis, there's a real and perceived sense of powerlessness, there's marginalization, there's often a strong connection to land and nature, and also entanglement with resource extraction are some of the unique factors in this context. Of course, there's a great, heterogeneity and diversity among or across rural, remote, and small communities, but looking at this study at this broad context. And so you can see, I won't dive into this specific kind of piece here, but if anyone has questions, I just want to continue to move forward in the name of time here. And so we heard from and we talked to 27 participants across what we presently call Canada, and 23 of these 27 also participated in the letter writing dimension of the study. And so here you can see just sort of the broad categories and dimensions of our interviews. But I also wanted to speak a little bit about the letter writing dimension. So we included this as a part of our data collection after completing an interview. So about 2 weeks after the interviews, we followed up with participants about their interest in also participating in the letter writing dimension. And I'm actually going to read the prompt that we shared. It's rather broad, in fact, which is sort of best practice in letter writing in a number of ways in terms of data. So here was the prompt. Your letter can be self-reflective, simple, poetic, a call to action, or an opportunity to give voice to the earth or another species. Your letter can be long or short. Feel free to be creative in your letter writing. Now, in terms of analysis, so we analyze this as a single data set in terms of the interviews and the letters, and I use a specific process called thematic network analysis, which is a qualitative data analysis method, which leads to the emergence of themes across 3 levels of meaning, specifically basic themes, organizing themes, and global themes. And I'm going to move into these findings now. And so I'm going to share these themes that emerge through the thematic network analysis. And also, as I do, I'm going to share some of the key insights or contributions related to these findings. Now, one flag to just mention, so there were 4 global themes that emerged in the analysis, but in the paper, and I decided to do the same thing for this presentation, I speak to 3. And this 4th global theme, navigating complex climate emotions and their consequences, I'll say stay tuned. I'm currently working on a paper that will specifically present that dimension. And so moving into the other 3 global themes that really describe the lived experiences of climate emotions. So the first speaks to the sort of nature of climate emotions. And many of you who do work in this space will know this well as highly complex, often intense, and frequently challenging for those who are experiencing climate emotions. And so the 2 organizing themes include core climate emotions and emotional constellations. I'll speak to these more specifically in a moment, and also affective dimensions. Now, in terms of these core climate emotions, there were a set that emerged very commonly that were described in depth and richness by participants. And this will be probably no surprise to many of you. It maps onto much of the research, existing research, and these included anger, worry, frustration, fear, sadness, and powerlessness. Some may be thinking this is often the set of emotions, is often how we are increasingly thinking about and defining and describing climate anxiety. So something to take note of there. So beyond this set of core emotions, there are also many others. This included as well guilt and grief. They were also common, and there were some intriguing socio-demographic differences in relation to guilt and grief in particular. And some folks may be also wondering about hope. Hope, of course, we've heard a lot about hope already in this summit. So interestingly, in these data, hope was discussed, but most commonly as a yearning for or a seeking hope or wanting to find sources of hope. So those kinds of things, rather than actually holding or experiencing hope related to climate change and climate injustices. Now, this notion of emotional constellations, this is, I think, an important contribution of this study. And I think it's important because we see in the data, and I've done a number of other projects and research studies around climate emotions as well, and I'm starting to see this as quite important. This notion of clusters of emotions, excuse me, that are frequently experienced together. And so we can see this in a quote from Mariah. A story arc, she described her experiences as a story arc that often starts with anxiety, moving through frustration, and then to sadness. So, this is one example of a cluster that was quite common: anxiety, frustration, sadness. Another example included fear, guilt, and powerlessness. So, I think this notion of constellations is important as we think about our efforts towards collective coping. Now, moving on to these affective dilemmas, this is another, I think, quite important implication of this study. So, what are affective dilemmas? This is the tensions that arise from various emotions elicited by climate change and related social phenomena. And so there were three specific affective dilemmas that emerged in these data, and I want to speak to each of these very briefly. So the first is not wanting to burden others with emotions, but in fact, wanting to talk about emotions. And this actually emerged in many of the interviews themselves. Participants would say, I really am valuing and enjoying this chance to talk to someone about my emotions, but I'm very sorry to burden you, the interviewer with these emotions. So that was actually quite common. And so here's Spencer. I'll share Spencer's quote to give life to this. But it's hard to talk with friends about it, these emotions, because you don't want to bum your friends out. You don't want to be like, oh, let's get together and talk about the saddest thing we can think of. So I try not to, even though, I kind of want to because it's on my mind all the time. So a second affective dilemma, speaks to questions around, rather common questions around appropriateness and validity of emotion. So many times this was related to actually privilege. Is it appropriate to feel guilty? Is it appropriate to feel fear? What is appropriate? What is not? And so here's Emerson. We are told all the time that anxiety is irrational. It's our body's response to things that no longer are a danger to us. But it's like this thing, climate change, is something that is very real. And it's so kind of like this anxiety. Is it rational? In this case, it's rational, I think. So that was Emerson expressing this questioning around what's appropriate here to feel in relation to climate change and climate emotions. And the final affective dimension has to do with this balancing of often, or what participants expressed as seemingly opposing emotions. So what should come to mind here is, the fear and hope, the despair and hope, or the dread and hope. Oh, there goes my voice. Sorry. So also an example of affective dilemmas. So moving on to the second global theme, which describes those factors that give rise and shape to climate emotions. Now, what we see commonly in research and other data is this idea that experiencing climate change, bearing witness to climate change, learning about climate change are a key factor or primary factor giving rise and shape to climate change. So this is certainly something that emerged from the data, including both extreme events and gradual change and also vicarious experiences. But many other factors emerged as well and beyond this. This included identities and privilege. This included responsibility and concern for future generation. Every single participant expressed concern and responsibility towards future generations as giving rise to their climate emotions. Also, questions around action or how much action and not enough action, particularly at the individual level, and also inadequate action from those in positions of power, commonly given rise to frustration and sense of powerlessness, for example. And the final organizing theme here is around place. And this is quite interesting to me, and I think important contribution. I have a strong interest in place in my work broadly and in relation to climate and mental health as well. So what we saw here in the data is connection to nature. This actually connects to some other presentations and pieces we've heard in this summit so far, and also a rather pervasive and impactful, what I'm talking about as a socialized climate of silence. And so here's examples from Morgan and Avery to speak to this climate of silence. So where I live in Saskatchewan, there's not much support here for talking about emotions and climate change. Or Avery, sometimes I feel like I'm the only one in this community who's feeling this so deeply. Why am I so devastated by this? I feel so alone, and sometimes with the level of distress that I have. And so these dimensions, I think, are particularly important for this rural, remote, and small community and town context that this study explored in particular. And there were actually a handful of participants who had moved from large urban centers to smaller towns or rural settings that spoke to changes in their experiences of this climate of silence, having moved from an urban center to a small community. And so the final global theme that I wanted to share a little bit about has to do with the consequences of climate emotions. And so we know from a range of other data, there are a number of consequences for mental health and well-being. But one of the interesting contributions from this work is actually a range of consequences in addition to and beyond mental and emotional health. And this included, for example, embodiment and physical health. And of course, I think many of us in this summit probably think and should think about mental and physical health as very much interconnected, and this is certainly true. But just to share an example of embodiment and physical health, here's Mariah. It gets to a point where I'm like, I can't breathe. Like I have this heaviness in my chest. And this notion of being unable to breathe and heaviness was actually described quite commonly when speaking to the lived experiences of climate emotions. And then finally, this dimension of life decisions and action and inaction. So there's a number of themes here that speak to the ways in which climate emotions, the lived experiences of climate emotions, have consequences in terms of people questioning having children, engaging with action both at the individual and collective level, and also decisions around lifestyle, context, and relationships. And although this was uncommon, there are some examples around this sort of paralysis and not being able to take any action or feeling rather numb and paralyzed in relation to climate emotions. So those are the core findings that I wanted to share. And just to pull out some of the key threads that I think are particularly relevant, some key takeaways before I wrap up, or as by means to wrap up, I should say. So first of all, thinking of these core emotions and constellations of emotions, I think this is important for our conceptual understanding and even theorizing around climate emotions. Really, we're keeping in mind that intersecting identities and a range of factors give rise and give shape to lived experiences of climate emotions. This finding that I just spoke to, that there are consequences that go beyond, that include and go beyond mental and emotional health that are associated with climate emotions. And I think this study points to, and I speak to this more at length in the paper, but climate emotions may be particularly consequential and relevant beyond the metropolis. And I think this has to do with this pervasive climate of silence and also deep connections to the nature and land. And finally, of course, we need to keep always in mind when we're thinking about this work and what to do next, the sort of what now, what next thinking in terms of collective coping. And this is what a lot of my other work is actually focusing on currently. But collective coping should address this climate of silence and should recognize and engage with the affective dilemmas that emerged from these data. And just a very quick plug before I wrap up. So this is one study I'm speaking to, but I'm also doing another project right now, a larger 4-year grant focused on climate anxiety and coping among youth and young adults in Canada. And one of the things that we're doing, just starting, is something called a field of practice analysis, where we're identifying and mapping organizations who work in particular with youth around coping. So if any of that sounds like you, please do reach out, because we are going to be doing this work of figuring out where this is happening across Canada and how people are doing this work, and creating some opportunity for conversation across those folks. So I'll wrap up. Merci, miigwech, thank you. And I'll look forward to questions. Hopefully I've left some time.
Thanks very much, Lindsay. That was informative and comprehensive as usual, so I really appreciate that. We have our first question from Jack Broadley, and he says, in your research in regards expressing effects and social stigma / don't rock the boat, silencing of people's emotions, did you get a sense of where the social stigma stems from?
That's such an excellent question. I think this is something I hope to dig in much more fully in some of my other work, because I think it's really important, and I think we need to understand this a lot more so that we can design collective and constructive coping practices and processes to address this. Where it stems from, I think, is where power lies in our society. So those in position of power are often those who benefit from resource extraction and therefore benefit from oil and gas, for example, in our nation, and you know, why we have climate change essentially. But in particular, in this context of rural, remote, and small communities, as I mentioned at the outset, this real entanglement with resource extraction, And it depends where you are in the nation what that looks like, but I think that's certainly part of it. So many of the participants who spoke to this are and some spoke to this at great length, in fact, feeling like they cannot speak to this in their community at all, both emotions and climate change. So there's a lot of social stigma around emotions and mental health. There's a lot of social stigma around climate change, and I actually think when they are together, it's a sort of an additive effect, creating this socialized climate of silence. But the some of the source, so I'm sort of surmising from some of these data and some of my other work, but I would like to really explore this at greater depth with a really specific project to really get at the root of some of this.
Great, thanks for that answer. We have another question, one from Peter. Has locus of control been considered as a factor in the degree of emotional risk? Does
Hmm.
participation in groups directly taking on climate mitigation actions like tree planting, river cleanup, solar power projects, etc., improve the ability to cope with climate anxiety over those who focus on what others should be doing? Great question, Peter.
Yeah, I think that is a great question. Yes, I think we see that in certainly other research as well, that taking action, engaging in an action, and particularly engaging in collective action addresses some of the sense of powerlessness. There are some folks, though, in these data that explain, particularly, this may be particularly relevant in the rural, remote, and small community context, that there is no collective action happening, that there are no opportunities for engaging in collective action. And so I think this brings, flags two things that in certain contexts, we really need to find opportunities for creating, um, space and opportunities for engaging with collective action that gives rise to a sense of powerlessness as opposed to, or power as opposed to powerlessness, which is quite common, particularly in this setting, I think. But I think that is a really important area for continued work. And I think it's true across a range of contexts beyond rural and small communities, but particularly in that context, I think.
Thanks,
Hopefully I
Liz.
answered the question.
You did. We have a question here. It says, and comment. Thank you so much for your body of work. In your name on Zoom, what does born 342 ppm CO2 mean? I'm seeing this a lot more, so I'm interested to hear your answer as well.
Yeah, so you can go and look at data. That's the year and month that I was born and the CO2 in the atmosphere at that time. I think it just reminds folks, because we all send emails all the time every day, way too often, how far we've, come in just my lifetime. So, as I mentioned, or I think I meant to say that I am, I am a climate researcher, but I'm also a climate activist. I'm also a climate educator. I'm also a mother. And so the work, yes, I do research around climate change and climate emotions and climate change and mental health, but related to that and essential is, I think, engaging in action and activism. And some of these small nudges are ways that I found quite useful to do this. And so whenever I teach, we engage, we go have a look, all of us go have a look and we think about that. And I've done some learning experiences in my teaching where I actually have folks go and do it with their family and ask their grandparents the year they were born and look at parts per million then and think about their children and then map on some different things that have happened across those life histories to just bring to life these data as well in a way.
Oh, that's a great thing to do. Okay, so here's a comment from Will. I've begun offering climate cafes here in Nova Scotia since last fall. I'm wondering if these are, and what others could be, good tools for rural youth.
Yes, I think definitely. So one of the things I think that is very true in the research broadly on climate and mental health, and I think we have a presentation later in the summit around that, and coping is that we have quite a lot of research around, still not enough, but a lot of research around experiences, how pervasive this is, how problematic this is, and not yet nearly enough research around sort of supporting practices and how to do this work well. There is, however, a ton of this work happening across the country, and that last project I was speaking to is trying to understand this more, and trying to understand how to do this well. in, for a range of populations, including rural youth as an example. So I think there will be some really unique dimension that have to be recognized and engaged with when we're thinking about rural context and when we're thinking about youth, when we're doing climate cafe work. Some of those affective dilemma pieces I think are certainly important, recognizing, for example, that pervasive climate of silence and the real stigma, particularly in rural, particularly among youth. So some of those pieces, so understanding the experiences from the range of research that we have, I think are really important to inform how we do the work of climate cafes and how we do that well. And I'm really looking forward to the next like 5 years in this realm of research because I think we're going to start to quickly learn about advancing in the research world about the how to do this well and for whom and in which in a range of places where. And I think we're going to have a lot more research over the next 5 years informing that. And I'm quite looking forward to that. But anyway, thank you also for your work of doing climate cafes. We need more of this, and we need this in particular with youth and in rural contexts. So thank you. Well,
Yeah, and a little plug for a session tomorrow all about climate cafes as well. So
yeah.
join. Okay, so the last question before we move to our next speaker. Is there a freeze element that reflects overwhelm? This comes from Kathy DeBreu. When discussing climate silence, the same could have been said for climate change silence just a few years ago. How do we
Mm,
create a culture of share as well as care?
such a great question. I'm really intrigued by this climate of silence dimension. And folks often, so often if I'm doing work or and I'm working in the community or I'm doing just talking with folks about climate change in general, folks will say, what can I do? And I actually say, you know what? One of the things we really need to do is talk about these things. It is so hard to talk about these things, particularly with the folks that are closest to us in our lives. I'm sure we've all had those experiences where it feels really hard to share our first of all, our experience and thoughts around climate change broadly, but in particular around our climate emotions. I think many, if not most of us, experience climate emotions in a range of ways, as we see in these data and others. They're very diverse. It depends on who you are, where you are, your life history, and a range of other factors. But that's what we see in the data is that's what we should expect, that it's very diverse. And that's what we should allow to be, that there is no certain ways. We saw that also a questioning around what's appropriate, what's not. Whatever you experience is appropriate. And the way we can start breaking down that silence is to have those conversations. And so encourage folks to, in safe, sometimes to start in safer spaces, places where you feel safe. Those of us have more power in society, like myself. I'm a position of privilege and power. I should recognize that position of privilege and power and push the boundaries a little more than maybe some people feel safe or comfortable doing. So also keep that in mind. But I would like to perhaps put that out there to this week, take that upon yourself as a challenge to share some of your climate emotions and bring that into a relationship or a space that is maybe you haven't before. And then I think collectively those ripples might start to create a bit of a wave of change.
Great, thanks. I like ending on that note of hope as well. We
Mhm.
can have these conversations, and it's a great starting place. So thanks very much, Dr. Galway, and
My pleasure.
look forward to hearing more from your research group. Thanks very much.